there is a need for the river to continue flowing in areas like Baram, because river is essentially life. It is a part of the whole ecosystem, and you cannot disrupt the natural flow of rivers or entities or like this without having an effect. So for us who grew up with this reciprocal relationship with nature and each other, it's a horror story that's going to happen. Like there is this anxiety that's coming upon us, knowing that if this really happens to the natural flow of the river, there will be consequences and natural consequences that I don't think any one of us will be prepared for.
Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is activist Celine Lim, the managing director of SAVE Rivers, a civil society organization based in the Malaysian state of Sarawak. She speaks with co-host Rachel Donald about a dam proposal in the Baram district. This dam is one of 3 recently announced by Malaysian officials, who Celine says made it already seem like the projects were confirmed. Yet residents who will be impacted by the construction of these projects have not been properly consulted yet, she says. Celine details how her community relies on the Tutoh River and how official statements that residents no longer use it for transport are untrue, and displays a lack of understanding of their community's way of life and the ecosystem it relies on. It's a common occurrence, other activists say, that Malaysian officials will leave residents in the dark about development projects such as this. The state already has 5 hydro dam projects and currently exports power to neighboring Indonesia. They also plan to export power to Brunei and Singapore. Celine emphasizes the harm hydro dam projects have caused in the state and calls for transparent consultation processes, which are supposed to be guaranteed as outlined by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is not properly enforced in Malaysia or in any country for that matter.
Celine, welcome to the show. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, could you explain what's going on with hydropower energy in Sarawak and the 3 new dams that have been proposed?
So my name is Celine. I'm the managing director of SAVE Rivers. So we are locally based, and when I mean local, it is Miri-based, Sarawak. And our project site, or at least our focus areas, are the Indigenous territorial domains, which are located primarily in Baram, which is north of Sarawak. So SAVE Rivers have had quite a history with the communities there as well, because we also, together with the community, and it started out as a people's movement against, at that time in probably 2012, a plan to have mega hydro dam all around Sarawak. There was supposed to be 12 mega hydro dam projects that were supposed to be scheduled, and one of the area is Baram, which would have displaced around 20,000 community members that were affected or at least located in the impacted areas. So when communities heard about this, they organized themselves. And again, this is probably one of the stories that I would tell with a lot of pride, and how the communities really came together to organize themselves and to defend their territorial domain. And not only that, it's their home essentially. So this is how we started out at SAVE Rivers. And in 2015, because of probably, again, a lot of the pressure and a lot of the visibility that the issue was getting, the then government, or the then chief minister, the late Dinan Satem, actually shelved the whole project. So again, I use the word shelf because officially that was what was used. So right now we're in 2024, and just last year, 2023, in September, our premier, again, the highest of our state leader, highest of state, actually made an announcement in an event known as the Baram Regatta, which we would have annually, so every year. And he announced that communities have agreed and given green light on cascading dams that were to be built also in the area of Upper Tutoh River. And this is again located in the Baram area. So when this happened, it definitely threw the community into a frenzy because no one knew of this plan before the announcement. So I think the reaction is validated. And what communities did, one of the first thing they did was they wanted to ask, they had so much questions and they needed answers. And mind you, at that time, what the first thing we did was to write a letter. So communities came together and they rang up Save Rivers, and we sat down with the representatives from a few of these communities affected. And we wrote a letter again because we're civil society and we try to engage with the democratic process as much as we can. So we did. And we have sent all of these letters, inquiry letters, to many of the respective agencies. And interestingly, we've sent around probably 2 to 3 letters to different people. We have not received any official response to any of these letters, while at the same time, we kept it in-house, like it was a direct communication to the agencies, direct communication to these departments. And when they started utilizing the media platform to talk about how communities have given green light to the project, that was when we also reacted. So we also engaged with the media platform and started putting out our narrative out there. So it was when our narrative was out there and all, that was when we had a response from, at least sort of like an official response from the government. But of course, mind you, it was not a response to the letter, it was a response to the public statement that we gave out. And one of the things that they said, that they called us premature, that we should have waited for visibility studies to be done first. And which also begs the question, if feasibility studies were not done, why was the head of state so confidently saying that it has been given green light? So again, these are very justifiable questions. And as right holders, we have all the right to ask these questions. So again, there was a lot of back and forth in the media. And we thought one of the best way to really show consensus or majority opinion was to run a petition. And we did. And in less than 2 months, we were able to gather 650 signatures from community. So again, I know that your question was asking about the plan of the dam and all, but I needed to provide this context why there was a reaction from the ground. And it was not necessarily a reaction or a resistance to development, but it was a reaction to why communities directly impacted by these projects were never consulted to begin with. That the only way that we knew of these projects was when media was reporting about it. So again, we asked the question, who was this media and who was this statement for? Was it really to impress outside investors? But at the end of the day, it was also important for the public to know that no consent was given prior, because no consultation was done. So again, this was the capacity in which we understood the project, or at least right now, one thing I need to put on the table too is that probably just a month ago, the relevant representative actually called for an initial sit down with affected communities, association, and also civil society, which again is a plus, and it should be done. It's the most basic and minor requirement. So they have called for that first sit down, and in this first sit down, they have announced that they will carry out a feasibility study, and from this study, we will then gauge whether community want or don't want the project. So this is the bare minimum that one should do when it is involving communities and we don't even know what the parameters of these projects are, what does it mean for them, and so on. So this is where we are at now. We still don't know any technicalities or anything about the project per se. They want to still run this first initial visibility studies, which includes an introduction to the projects and so on to the communities, but we have yet to receive any, at least on our end as civil society, any details on these supposed projects. So that's where we are at.
I think it's important to highlight as well for our audience in the United States and elsewhere in the global north that when you're talking about the green light or consent, this isn't a, consideration that the government owes out of a sense of, duty. I mean, this is a legal requirement in a place like Malaysia, where there are still very many Indigenous communities who technically own the land. Mm-hmm. You need to get free and prior informed consent for communities that are going to be affected. Otherwise, it's not a legal development. But unfortunately, Sarawak has seen a huge number of developments over the past 60 odd years, essentially, since independence, that did not involve free, prior and informed consent from the communities. And that's why civil society is so important, because otherwise, historically, things just happen without a community involvement.
Exactly. And also to put a very important element in this is that Malaysia also has signed on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So which means that, again, as Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, we do have a right that is afforded to us when it comes to our territorial domain.
For more context on UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, please see our conversation with Galina Angarava and Ian Morse, which is on this very podcast. But in short, Morse explained in that conversation that FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent, which is also an international law, is not sufficiently enforced in any nation worldwide.
So again, one of the gaps that we have seen on the grassroots level is how there is a lack of policies, there's a lack of local governance that actually supports this. So for SAVE Rivers experiences, a lot of this language for free, prior, informed consent was actually found mostly in sustainable schemes, right? You could have things like the RSPO, the Roundtable Sustainable or for palm oil, and also the Malaysian chapter, which is the MSPO. And for timber, which is like Malaysian Timber Certification Council, they have put this language of free, prior, and informed consent within their schematics. But again, what's written in the scheme and what's happening on the ground, this is where very importantly civil society needs to operate and function in, to see whether what's in the policy and what's in the schematics is actually parallels on the reality of on the ground. So again, I want to really emphasize here that for the local governance, we hardly see, there is really a lack of this language within our local governance. And it was only because the international market demand that free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples are respected that you find it in sustainable scheme. But whether or not the sustainable scheme is really sustainable, that is probably another podcast altogether, right? So this is probably where the gaps are as Sarawakians and as Malaysian, that again, Sarawak is majority Indigenous people, and until today, it's so mind-blowing how the majority is in essence by policy being discriminated when it comes to our territorial rights.
There's so much in what you've just said, and I would encourage anyone listening to this as well who wants to get a really accurate understanding of how the peoples of Sarawak have been discriminated against by their own governments historically to go and read up on Sarawak Report, which is an independent news platform that platforms the voices and struggles of Indigenous peoples. And what Sarawak Report has reported very recently is that the environmental impact assessments, i.e. the studies that are done to show what the impact of a development would be in a local area, have been hidden, which is another problem that occurs all over Malaysia with regards to these dams, which makes it almost then impossible for communities to say whether or not they consent. So hydropower is seen as a sustainable energy source, but what is the impact of these huge dam projects on the local communities, on their capacity to sustain themselves, and on the environment around them?
Right. I mean, we don't have to go very far to see the impact for Sarawak. Like you do have the Blakun and the Murung Dam as well. I mean, as much as things have happened, for Bakun and Murum. But it was also because of what happened in those areas. The communities in Baram were resolute of not having the mega hydro dam happening or being built in Baram, because we have seen its impact to our fellow community members as well in the Belaga area. So if you were to visit Belaka, they are now definitely has been relocated. That's the term that is used. But whether or not they were really involved in the process of relocation, that backs a whole different narrative altogether, because this is also when a lot of the civil society came together for there are a lot of documentations that's available on online in regards to the violations that have happened because of the Bakun and Murum dam project. So until today, again, you have communities that have been displaced in this area, and they are separated. They are divorced from their territorial domains. A lot of the narrative that we hear is they are now having to resort to areas that are so small. They cannot go into the forest anymore because again, traditionally we are forest dependent communities, and to have this forest ground so much that you lose this part of your culture where you are so used to go into the forest to get your natural resources. I mean, there is one particular term that a lot of my elders use, which is the forest is our supermarket. So literally that really is the cultural marker of our Indigenous communities, that we are by tradition a forest dependent community. And to have an area run in that manner, you are forced to change. And this change was definitely not slow. It was abrupt, and you have no choice but to survive. So again, from a community that was thriving because the forests were lush, and what we needed was provided by our natural resources, you are forced to change, you are forced to adapt. And this was changes and adaptation that you were not ready for in many ways. So right now, I would like to say that it is a sad reality, but also in so many ways, this is where my Indigenous communities have been quite an inspiration for us as well. They have shown us a lot of resilience in so many ways. Like even if you were to visit them in this relocated area, yes, there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of grief, but they do talk about surviving, and yet the sad part here is you're not meant to survive, you are meant to thrive in your own area, so this is where we are at. And a lot of the compensation narrative has not really been fulfilled as well. And if you again are to visit many of these communities, compensations were not really done as promised prior to the development of the dams. So for social impact, that's what we have seen. And again, we don't have to travel far. It's right here in our backyard in Belaga. And if we do not change our modus operandi in approaching our communities, in engaging with them, in including them in the decision making, history will repeat itself. Even in this new cascading dam, supposedly renewable energy project that is going to elevate Sarawak into the future and so on. So this is what we say. We're not against development, but fix the very fundamental first before we talk about moving forward. So yeah.
Hey, it's me again. I just wanted to drop a little note to say thank you so much for listening and supporting the Manga Bay newscast. We really couldn't do the deep dive reporting on some of the world's biggest environmental issues without you tuning in and listening to it. If you're currently listening to us on your browser, such as Google Chrome or Firefox, or even Opera if you use it, we highly recommend that you subscribe to us through your podcast provider, because that helps support our show further. It raises its profile and brings us to a wider audience, and it allows you to stay up to date when we release new episodes and browse our previous ones. And if you're really enjoying this podcast and you want to support us further, share this episode with a friend and tell everyone you can about the Manga Bay newscast. Thank you so much for listening. And now, back to the conversation.
Well, indeed. Sarawak is an incredibly rich state. I mean, the amount of resources with regard to the forest, even oil and gas, hydropower, and yet these are resources and riches that have not trickled down to the communities. And it was over a decade ago that Monga Bay reported that 80% of Borneo's rainforests had been impacted by logging.
Monga Bay's Rhett Butler reported this in 2013 when that report was released. However, the data used in the study was from 2009.
And that can mean that they had been logged or that the parts of the forest have been cleared to put through logging roads, essentially. So this is a question of life and death. And yet the majority of Sarawak's population are still living in poverty whilst their resources are being extracted from. Yes. And I think it speaks to, you know, what civil society, what you've just said about this divorce between governance and populations. And the Sarawak Chief Minister, Abang Johari Openg, has gone on record recently to say that we shouldn't really worry about these dams because nobody uses rivers to navigate anymore because now there are roads in Sarawak. What is your reaction to his statement?
Right. For him to just narrow it down to the fact that no one uses the river, and that's the reason why we should have all the cascading dam and the projects on it, also shows that he fails to understand the balance between ecosystem. There is a need for the river to continue flowing in areas like Baram because river is essentially life. It is a part of the whole ecosystem, and you cannot disrupt the natural flow of rivers or entities or like this without having an effect. So for us who grew up with this reciprocal relationship with nature and each other, it's a horror story that's going to happen. Like there is this anxiety that's coming upon us, knowing that if this really happens to the natural flow of the river, there will be consequences and natural consequences that I don't think any one of us will be prepared for. So for him to just narrow it down to the fact that no one uses it, again, it really gives this idea that even our head of state don't understand this fragile balance of our ecosystem altogether. So that's one. And number two, people still use the river, right? All you need to do is just spend a little bit of time with the communities in Baram. You see that they will use the river every single day. They use it to go to their farms. They are fishing in the river. They are going down every single day. It is still a mode of transportation, regardless or not there is roads. River is still essentially very life-giving to the communities. It is essentially still a huge part of our lives in the community as well. So I would say the Premier needs to probably back it up with some data to actually show that communities are not using the river. Therefore, the river can be included in this whole project site and so on. So again, the burden of proof when it comes to this must come from the government because they are given the privilege, they are given the tools to actually come out with data and researchers to show that rivers are not being used in that manner. So for him to just say that, I would respectfully say it needs to be backed up with data and researchers.
I think this speaks to the huge power dynamic, though, between Indigenous communities on the ground and the governance structure of Sarawak and Malaysia more widely. Because historically it has been that officials can go on record to say such things or to enact developments or to say that a development has been given the green light by communities and they don't have to back it up. They just bulldoze through in order to achieve what they want. And the problem is they have international backing to do this because it is not just Malaysia that seeks Sarawak's resources, it's also the international community. So do we have any details at the moment of international companies or partners that are also involved in these projects?
Like right now, probably for the renewable energy sector, I don't necessarily have those details just yet. Because again, we are supposedly at a stage where it is a feasibility study. So again, what we need probably as a civil society is to continuously demand this very basic information. on the project. So right now there is no one I can name, but it will not be for long. So this is probably again what we are doing as civil society to actually make sure that these information and data is also transmitted correctly to the right holders. So this is where we are at least at the moment.
Sarawak reported a couple of weeks ago that apparently one of the plans with the dams is to create green hydrogen, which is a questionable energy source, given that it is incredibly inefficient using renewable energy in order to create electricity. And it's actually an energy development that typically has huge links to the oil and gas industry. And yet green hydrogen has been something that Sarawak has kind of been banging the drum about for a while. The problem is, of course, that it's fine to speak to all of these developments, but without a plan in place to prove how such developments are going to benefit local communities, all it means is continued resource extraction and continuing poverty for Sarawakians.
Exactly. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And again, what we're asking for is a very basic, fundamental information that is from a group of people that will be impacted, and we have all the rights to ask for it. So I think, again, this is where I go over and over again to this statement that we're not against development, but at the end of the day, this very basic, fundamental human rights approach must be integrated. For us to be a part, we need to be a part of this narrative and not just brought into it as a checklist or a tokenism. But at the end of the day, too, one of the things that has always happened when developers or even external actors step into the community area, one of the fundamental things that I've always felt to do is to always leave a copy of the documentations with the community. Again, very basic approach. The fact that you don't or refuse to actually leave those documentations, and the only reason why we know they came in or what it was because communities are now at a place where they are able to use their phone to take a photo of those documentations. But whether or not those hard copy documentations were actually left with the community, it isn't. So it is so mind-boggling that even this kind of fundamental approach is also not upheld. And how do you talk about, bringing in international stakeholders when a very basic, again, in-house fundamental, your duty to your people, your duty to impacted communities are not carried out? So, yeah.
Fortunately, though, there is another international community sort of networks around the world and involved in supporting one another. I understand that you were in the United States recently to see a dam removal project that has been led by Indigenous people there. Who did you visit and what did you see?
So we had the privilege to actually visit the Klamath River, and these were communities that were in California, Northern California. And again, that was the very first time I've ever been in that area. But the Iron Gate, that was called the Iron Gate Dam removal, like that particular event or happening in the area was that. And I wanted to go over there to see that. So I've had the privilege to actually speak to the UNDRIP communities that were based in North of California, and they have been living there for generations. And they talked about when the dam was built in probably the 1910s or the 1900s, how that has totally changed the livelihood of the communities, and so much grief actually was experienced in the whole building of the dam.
There were actually 4 major dams that were built along the Klamath River between 1900 and the 1960s, 3 of them in Northern California and 1 in Southern Oregon, and they degraded a crucial source of water, salmon, and lots of wildlife. Indigenous residents have depended on the river for at least 7,000 years or more. It is the ancestral home of the Karuk, Yurok, and Hupa tribes.
Like the river stopped flowing. The salmon, which was a huge part of their diet, a huge part of their cultural identity. And again, the river too was a huge part of their cultural identity. This was all forcefully taken away because of the dam. And again, this was in the 1900s. So to hear how much the dam has really affected so many of the indigenous communities there, it really left a deep impression. But one of the things, and as much as there was so much grief, I was also very inspired how they talk about rebuilding, and they talk about how happy they are that the river will start flowing back, and that their children will then have the opportunity to taste the salmon back again, and nutritional diet will come back to the community. So I thought that was just such a hopeful narrative, as much as we don't want to forget the past and we don't want to forget what has happened. And I found myself in a place where I had to sort of like juggle between grief and celebration, and the fact that, when the dam is decommissioned down the line and the river will start flowing. So for me, it really did live a very meaningful and impactful. Yeah, it was an impactful event for me. So I still think about. I still thought it was very surreal that I get to experience that as well. But I definitely came back a lot more motivated that mega hydro dam is never a good news for communities, and definitely not a good news for environment. And I don't think where I am now I could even want to entertain the thought of mega hydro dams or any of the areas where we work in. So yeah, so that was very meaningful for me to be able to just connect with my uh, fellow communities in California.
I think it's always really lovely to hear of people linking up around the world and these sort of moments of resistance and sharing knowledge and seeing that things are possible. So, I mean, tell me, did they have any advice for you in Sarawak about how to approach this problem of mega hydro dams or even restoring the river afterwards?
So I think what we did was to just exchange again experiences and where we are at. A lot more of what we exchanged was more on solidarity, and that, if any
Mm.
time that they could be of a help to amplify a lot of the issues that I hear, they will be more than happy to. And again, it is a time of kinship. But at the end of the day, bottom line, it is an absolute no, that mega hydro dam should not be built, and as much as we could resist in whatever capacity, we should. So I came out definitely a lot more motivated in making sure that we understand the context of our own struggle and how to approach it as Sarawakian, as right holders of this land and of the state. So yeah.
Well, I'm so pleased to hear all of that. Celine, thank you so much for your time today and good luck.
Thank you for having me.
The first thing I wanted to highlight was that I thought that the first opening 10 minutes of Celine talking were incredibly illuminating insight into how the public relations apparatus of the government of Sarawak operates. I thought that was really incredible insight that she shared, and disheartening, obviously, but that was really important for people to understand and see, for sure.
Yes. And I think as well, the connection between just how close that connection is between that government and the surrounding extractive industries. I mean, in the kind of world of investigating Sarawak, we refer to logging companies as the timber mafia, and their relationships with government as government having relationships with a form of mafia, doing anything and everything to extract the resources from the local populace. It's a really dire situation for people on the ground.
Yeah, and just there's some important context that I think is important for listeners to know that may have gotten mentioned in the conversation, but I wanted to go into it more. So among some of the things that Abang Jahari said, which Celine says is not true, is that residents had been asking for these dams. So that was something that he used to justify the project. And he also said that they were to help prevent crocodile populations from growing, which, yeah, I'm not sure why that's a justification, why that's being used as a justification. But at any rate, the dams are to be built by private companies and run by the state utility company, Sarawak Energy Berhad. Now, when Mongabay reported on this story, they did not respond to our request for comment, and neither did two of Sarawak officials. So the dams that are being built are supposedly to provide more power to the state, right? But Sarawak Energy already has 4 hydropower dams, which provide 61% of the state's energy. And this state exports energy to Indonesia, West Kalimantan, and is planning to export it to Brunei and Singapore. So I found it interesting that they're using these projects as justification for providing more energy to the state, while at the same time they have plans to export it. I just found that to be a little conflicting.
A little. The cognitive dissonance that goes on in Malaysia with regards to what is done and what is said is really astonishing. And as a young journalist, like, this is where I cut my teeth, essentially, reporting on Sarawak and what was going on there.
Yeah.
And I found it to be a really extraordinary exercise in understanding how corruption works, because you and I come from very developed, quote unquote, countries with regards to how, the United Nations refers to that. And also, I think you could say that that development is also present in how au fait governments are, or press agencies are, in speaking to the media and ensuring that messages get a little mixed, or that the reality of intentions are hidden. And it's really astonishing in Malaysia because they don't have that same necessity of obfuscation, because the state and the industries have so much power. So they can literally say one thing and do another and get away with it. And it was there that I learned just how deep corruption goes, because of just seeing that day after day after day. So it's no surprise to me whatsoever that they have come out and said one thing, even though the numbers and the data and the intention for the plans show something else. And what is just crippling is knowing that there is very little that people can do on the ground about that, even though it's there in black and white. And that's why organizations like Save Rivers are so important.
Yeah. Really quick, just want to give a shout out to our reporter, Danielle Keeton-Olsen, who reported on this story. And did a fantastic job speaking with the sources, people actually on the ground who are part of these communities, like Celine and another activist who was interviewed for the story named Willie. And these are people who can provide the actual insight from a local perspective. And I think this just highlights why it's so important to get that perspective when you're a reporter and you're reporting on, quote unquote, development projects that are touted as development for a community. It's important to seek out and clarify whether that's actually happening. And we're seeing here that communities are not being properly consulted at the outset before announcements are made that are seemingly official announcements. And one thing that Celine mentioned that she says that companies often don't do is leave a copy of the documentation detailing the project with the community. Like they don't leave any documents. And that's a hugely important thing to have if you want to properly assess whether a project, like the details of a project, because you can give it to someone else to help you look it over and assess legalities of things and processes and procedures. And if a company doesn't do that, that's a huge red flag that needs to be highlighted. So I found that to be, unfortunately not shocking, but also incredibly important to point out.
Absolutely. And another thing they do is, which is required by law, environmental impact assessments, is that they will not release those environmental impact assessments to the public, even though legally they are required to, just in case the EIA shows something that they don't want to see. Or they will deliberately hire a company that has links to, shareholders or stakeholders in the development to do the EIA and give them the result that they want. I mean, this was reported on time and time again by companies like Mongabay and Sarawak Report. It will just do anything and everything to get around the legal barriers to extracting these resources.
Yeah. One thing I did want to highlight, a quote from the article from the activist Willie Kajan. He said, quote, "They, Sarawak officials, are only trying to lobby the investors. What they want is money from overseas, and the foreign investors do not know anything about what is happening in Sarawak. So, that's perspective from local activist, and I thought that was important to highlight. And you can read the full story in the show notes of this podcast.
I'd like to flag something important as well, which is the network of media covering countries like Malaysia. So there's media on the ground. There's, some local media, there's national media, and then obviously there's international organizations like Mongabay and Sarawak Report. And the reason why international attention and support from international journalists is so important is that there's still a lot of gag laws in a place like Malaysia for local journalists and national journalists. So, for example, it's still illegal in Malaysia to insult the royal family. And there's 7 royal families, I believe.
There are 7 hereditary monarchies in Malaysia, but there are 9 royal families for 9 Malaysian states.
And very often they are connected to these developments. They are shareholders in these developments, and they are gaining private income from these developments. And so it makes it very, very difficult for reporters on the ground to really accurately investigate and report on these topics, which is why support from the international media community is so critical to getting information on the ground to people that need it to fight these things.
Yeah. And we both know a reporter who has been targeted and impacted by that, Claire Rucastle-Brown. So, yeah, super difficult to report on this area, this state in Malaysia. So thank you for bringing that up, Rachel. One last thing I wanted to talk about real quick was the Klamath River dams that are coming down. So in this conversation, she highlights one of them that she visited. There are actually 4 of them coming down, and it is the largest, I believe, the largest dam removal project in the history of the United States. So this is a quite literally huge deal. And something else that I wanted to highlight is that I believe they're going to be completed. The full dismantle of all of them will be completed sometime this year around October, I think. And the thing about the Klamath River is that it has been used by indigenous populations for at least 7,000 years or more. And it was, lots of media outlets have done a pretty good job identifying that it is a critical source of salmon. But it's just a massive source for all kinds of fish and wildlife that have been endangered from the building of these 4 dams. And entire assessments have been carried out, and people from the NOAA have looked into what it would mean to dismantle these dams and allow nature to recuperate. And so they are going ahead with removing these dams. I believe it was the Washington Post that highlighted that ultimately it came down to an economic decision, cynically. But it is a thing that is happening this year, and thankfully so.
Excellent. Well, here's hoping we'll see more of these projects around the world, because if there's one policy that everyone in the world could and should agree on, it is rewilding as a way through this crisis that is enveloping our planet. We need more of nature, and we need to get out of nature's way.
Well said, Rachel. Well, excellent conversation, and I hope all the folks here read the article on Mongabay, and if you want to check out Save Rivers, I've linked information in the show notes as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Rachel. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content, such as our sister series, Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work that we're doing and tell a friend. Word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach, but you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Did you know that Mongabay is a non-profit news outlet? That's right. Even just $1 per month makes a difference, and it helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, go to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more about us and support the Mongabay newscast and all of our podcast content. And you and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just look for the Mongabay Newscast app on either app store to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you absolutely can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or you can follow us on social media. We have accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, and also on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.